Mysore Meetup group. So today we have the topic SAP integration with MuleSoft. So Kamalika is here with us, so she will be speaking on this. So before that, I want to read out some safe harbor statement. So both the speaker and the host are organizing this meetup in individual capacity only, and this presentation is strictly for learning purpose only. And this presentation is not meant for any promotional activities. It's some housekeeping rules. We will be uploading this recording to YouTube and to Meetup page as well, and you can just check out within 24 hours. We'll upload that, and presentation will also be there. So questions you can ask at any time in the chat. We have enabled mics for you as well, so you can directly ask from the speaker as well, and give us feedback. We do look at that. And yeah, so we have two organizers for this meetup. So myself, I'm Shubham. I'm working as a professional integration developer in Millennium. So that's all about me. Over to you, Giri.
Thank you, Shubham. So, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So, myself, I'm Giridhar. I'm a certified developer and architect in MuleSoft and AWS, working as a senior architect at Hashdin. I take care of MuleSoft accounts in Hashdin. So, I'm a MuleSoft mentor and leading the Mysore group. That's all about me. And coming to feedback, as like you mentioned, we are expecting feedback from all of you. So it could be a correction, it could be a suggestion, whatever you feel. You can put this in the feedback form. So we will certainly going to take care all of your comments into consideration, and then we'll rectify those if you are providing any corrections, or if you are providing any suggestions, we'll take care of those as well. And coming to today's topic, today we have Kamalika. So to explain SAP's integration with Mule. So, and we have turned on your mic. So feel free to ask any of your questions or put it in the chat. We can take up at the end of the session. Over to you, Kamalika. All the best.
Hey, thank you, Giri. I will start by sharing my screen. Giri, if you can confirm, you can see my screen.
Yeah, visible.
Yeah, it's up.
Okay, okay then, cool. Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking out your time to join today, Saturday. Let me introduce myself. I am Kamalika Chaudhary. As Giri mentioned, I am based in Kolkata, India. I'm currently working in EPAM system as senior software engineer. You can find me in various platforms like LinkedIn, Medium, YouTube, etc. Feel free to connect with me there if you want to. Today, I will be talking about SAP integration using MuleSoft, which will broadly cover the SAP integration using SAP Connector for Mule4. We have covered other flavors and some other topic, but broadly we'll cover the SAP Connector Mule4, which connects to mainly SAP ECC system or the central ERP central component. Let's start with what is SAP. To say in simple terms, SAP is an ERP system which holds all the master data and different types of records of an organization. So, what will be a use case where you will integrate SAP using MuleSoft to any other system? Suppose one use case is SAP integration with MuleSoft would be that the organization wants to sync its master data stored in SAP with a CRM like Salesforce, say. So MuleSoft SAP connector comes in use in such scenarios. Suppose a master data are there in SAP, data has to move out of SAP to Salesforce. This can happen through IDoc. Maybe some changes are there in Salesforce or SAP which needs to be communicated. This can happen through BAPI functions as well. IDoc is mostly asynchronous, is always an asynchronous communication. Synchronous communication can happen through BAPI functions. These are the two type of operations supported by the SAP connector. Apart from that, if the SAP developer is able to develop and consume REST APIs, that is also an option, but that is not in the scope of this session. In this session, we are only discussing the SAP connector, and that only supports IDoc and BAPI functions. So in this session, I will cover the SAP Connector configurations, operations, what all operations the connector supports, some sample IDoc and RFC structure just to get you familiarized with how it will look like and what you will be looking in it to process it. These are all SAP payloads are in XML format. Various troubleshooting scenarios, that is the troubleshooting that I did when I have worked in these SAP projects. I have brought that forward so it may help anyone who is starting with it, and cover a bit about other flavors of SAP Connector. So starting with it, you can download the SAP Connector from Exchange. Once downloaded from Exchange, you will be able to find it in your Mule palette and view all 9 operations supported by the connector. In this slide, I want to briefly explain the different types of RFC calls, as we would be hearing about them again in upcoming slide. Connection between MuleSoft and SAP happens by remote function calls. And over remote function calls, we can send and receive IDocs or call BAPI function. Remote function calls can be divided into synchronous remote function call or asynchronous remote function call. Synchronous remote function call is when we have both client and server available and the result is expected immediately. That is, request is sent and a response is expected in the same call. In asynchronous remote function, we don't expect immediate response. This is the simple explanation. There are 2 special forms of asynchronous remote function call through which we will be using and sending IDocs or calling a BAPI function. One is TRFC, which ensures that particular function module is executed only once, not multiple, and that is done with the help of a transaction ID. So when a MuleSoft SAP connector is communicating using TRFC, we have to feed it with a transaction ID. So I will show you later on. There is a connector through which we can get a transaction ID and feed it. The other special from asynchronous remote function call is QRFC. This is an extension of TRFC where the sequence of individual steps are maintained. This is maintained internally with the help of a queue setup in SAP, and the SAP queue name will be additional input to MuleSoft SAP connector, which is communicating via QRFC. Moving on to the next slide, we see JCO libraries. These are very important because these are the libraries which help us send or receive IDoc or call a BAPI function, execute BAPI functions over synchronous remote function call or asynchronous remote function call. As I said, there are 2 types of remote function call. In asynchronous remote function call, there are 2 special forms, TRFC and QRFC. So whenever we are sending or receiving IDocs, it would be always asynchronous and it would be sent over TRFC or QRFC. Transformation of SAP object to XML and from XML to SAP object, because we will always get the payload in XML, that happens with the help of these JCO libraries. JCO is Java Connector libraries. So the SAP Connector is built and takes help of SAP Java Connector libraries to connect with SAP. In this page, we see how we can configure these libraries. This is mandatory for all the SAP connector configs. So from here, we start with the connector configuration. In this page, we see the SAP Java connector libraries. These 3 jar files are required to import in all the SAP config. As these jar files helps to send receive IDoc over ARFC and do BAPI functions or to convert SAP objects from onto XML, these jar files are available to be downloaded from SAP website, but it requires SAP ID. So you can take help of your project's SAP basis team to download them. These jar files can be added as local files or deployed to any binary repository like Nexus. After that, it can be added as Maven dependency in the Mule application POM file. There are 2 ways to configure. You can take from the local file, you can deploy it into a repository and give that as a dependency. The first 2 jar files IDoc library and JCO library, and same for all the operating system. The third one, JCO native library, please pay attention. This is different for different operating systems. So SAP JCO3.dll is for Windows, leave SAP JCO3.so is for Linux, and for Cloud leave SAP JCO3.so is for Linux. CloudHub is a Linux system, so you will be using leave SAP JCO3.so, and leave SAP JCO3.jni library is for macOS. So if you are working on Windows system and deploying on CloudHub, which is a Linux system, then in your local deployment development environment, you will be using a jar ending .dll. And when you are about to deploy to CloudHub, you will have to switch and point it to .so. The most common deployment error occurs when we forget to switch the jar files between the deployments. So we see that the jar files are required. So these are some of the errors you will face if you are missing one of the jar files. So JSU native library, if you miss it, you will get a Java JSU initialization failed with no SAP JSU in Java library path. This one will also come if you give a incorrect SAP JSU which is not as per the operating system. JCO library, this if you miss it, you will get a no class definition found and no JCO trace listener. IDoc library, if you miss this one, you will get a IDoc metadata unavailable exception. Based on these errors, we can figure out what we have missed and we can add it. Next is configuring the authentication. There are two types of authentication that is supported. One is via certificate, where we do not give the username password, and it is via username password, by giving the username password as the authentication method. Apart from the certificate, you see the system number and client ID also required. These are also SAP specific system informations, can be obtained from the SAP base system of your project. We are using the certificate when MuleSoft is acting as a client. So this is the one where we configure the certificate part, and the other option is to configure with username password. Once we have chosen the authentication type, next we have to understand if we are connecting to a message server host or an application server host. Message server acts as a load balancer over application server. If we are connecting to application server host, we'll require to provide the application server host or IP. So this screen that you see is connecting using the application server host. The other form of that can happen here is connecting to a message server host when there is a load balancer on top of the application server host. Then here we need the message server host, system ID, and the port to be given. These are all part of SAP configuration details. It may happen, I have seen in one of my project that the QA or the dev environment is connecting directly with the application server host, and then the production is connecting to the message server host. In this case, as these are either or, you have to configure two different configurations of SAP config, one for the dev and QA environment and one for the production environment to make it work. Next topic is SAP Connector. Reconnection. Reconnection in case of if we are listening for IDoc or function listener. Why I am covering this? Because this is different from the general reconnection strategy. SAP listener relies exclusively on the JCO library, which means that a mule reconnection mechanism has no impact on reconnection. The reconnection works in such a way that for the first time it waits for 1 second and tries to reconnect, then it waits for 2 seconds. Likewise, it doubles the wait time till it reaches 1 hour. No extra configuration is required for hours from your side to make this reconnection. It is already done by the JCO library. We have completed the minimum SAP connector configuration required for the SAP integration to work. For additional fine-grained configuration, you can refer to the documents. Next, we come to data exchange options available in SAP. There are two types of data exchange options, as I said earlier, IDoc and BAPI function. IDocs is a standard format defined by SAP for the exchange of information between SAP and non-SAP applications. IDocs are typically used when information needs to be sent to or from SAP without notifying requirements, primarily used to transfer master data in and out of SAP. Simple term, IDoc is used to transfer data in and out asynchronously, because in MuleSoft we are using IDoc listeners for listening to IDoc or sending IDoc. In both cases, it happens asynchronously. BAPI function, which is Business Application Programming Interface, is defined to call either by SAP or non-SAP applications. It is a function call. It has a request, and if it is a synchronous, it is done on synchronous remote function call. You can send a request and you receive a response. If it is a function listening over SRFC, then also once you receive a request, you have to form the response and send back to SAP. Let's start with the different IDoc operations that are there in SAP. We have the document listener, which is placed at source and listens to IDoc. All listener connectors placed at source have the gateway host, gateway port, and program ID to set to facilitate. Program ID creation should be unique. It can receive one or multiple IDocs in a single request based on the batch size configured at SAP site. Next is retrieve IDoc operation, where you have to give the IDoc name and it will retrieve that IDoc. Next is send IDoc operation, where we send an IDoc to SAP over an ARFC. Now ARFC can be of two types, TRFC and QRFC. To enable QRFC, you have to mention the queue name. To enable TRFC, you can set transaction ID. To set transaction ID, you can call a start transaction connector operation, and it will give you a transaction ID in the response, and you can send the same transaction ID in the send IDoc, and you can then confirm the transaction. This is just for the show purpose I have given the picture. Here we have some sample IDoc messages. Just to give an idea of someone who's just looking in IDoc for the first time, this is how an IDoc looks when we receive an IDoc. The first tag of it is the name of the IDoc. This is what we give to filter which IDoc we want to receive or to retrieve a IDoc. This is what the name, that is what we give or we identify IDoc as. So this is an order SO5 IDoc, and to uniquely identify, uh, you have this EDI DC40 section. This contains the metadata of the IDoc, and inside this there is a field docnum, which is almost common. Maybe this is not the IDoc you receive, but this structure and the first segment and this docnum part is common mostly in all the IDocs. Docnum contains the unique ID of that particular IDoc. You can receive a lot of order SO5 IDocs. To uniquely identify which IDoc it is, you can use the docnum field. And EDI DC40 is a segment which contains metadata of the IDoc. There are other segments which can vary based on your IDoc. Your IDoc name also can vary as per what IDoc you are receiving. So as I said earlier when I was discussing IDoc listener, that you can receive one or multiple IDoc based on the batch size configured at SAP side. If your SAP side batch size says you can receive 5 IDocs, so a listener can listen for one payload which contains 5 IDocs. And if you're receiving multiple IDocs, it will come in this IDoc segment where the IDoc name would be there and multiple IDoc segment. You can receive multiple IDocs in a single payload in a single listener transaction. And this is another a single IDoc example, just to show how it will come when multiple IDocs come in the single request. This is configurable at SAP side. Next, we move to the operations that are there for the BAPI function. First, we have the synchronous remote function call. It executes a BAPI function over SRFC. When you mention the function name in this connector, the function metadata request and response structures get loaded. If you are connected to SAP and you are mentioning the function name, in the metadata you can see the request and response structure, which makes it very easy to transform and send the request or form the response transformation in data wave. Asynchronous remote function call connector, which is this BAPI function which works over ARFC. It also has this two option of TRFC and QRFC. So if you are doing it using TRFC, you will be providing the transaction ID, and if TRFC is mandatory, QRFC is not. So transaction is mandatory for this connector, but Q is not. Next, we see the function listener, which listens to the BAPI function, and it is very similar to HTTP listener. Here, a request is triggered by SAP, and after your operation is completed with the request, you form the response payload and you send it back to SAP. This is also synchronous function. This also is executed on SRFC, and where it synchronously receive a request, you do your operations and form the response and send it back to SAP. Someone who has worked with HTTP listener, it is very similar to that. This connector, this operation is to retrieve the BAPI function. You have to give the BAPI function name. Here we see a sample RFC request. The first tag is the function name. It can be anything the SAP developer has said, that would be the function name. And we have broadly two sections, import and export. If we are listening to BAPI function, the request parameters will come in import. And if you are sending request to a synchronous remote function, we will transform and form the request, keeping the parameters in the import section. The export section contains the response. If we are sending block of a response to function listener, we will form the response payload parameters inside the export section. And if we are listening to the synchronous remote function call, then we will get the response here in the export section. So we have covered all the operations and some sample IDoc and RFC details. Next, we move to the troubleshooting. So this slide is basically based on my project experience, highlighting solutions to some of the issues I encountered so far. First one is not an issue, it is a prerequisite to keep in mind. Program ID creation configuration in SAP is required. This is required in gateway registration between SAP and MuleSoft for IDoc and BAPI function listeners. This should be unique for a given gateway. Now the rest too is troubleshooting tips. While deploying an IDoc listener flow, if you are getting an error that gateway registration has failed because an host is not allowed, where it will mention your particular IP address, then in that case you have to check if your IP is allowed at SAP side. If you are using VPC, then give the VPC CID range to SAP external security. So mainly you have to check if if MuleSoft's IP is allowed at SAP external security. If not, you will have to ask the SAP team to configure it so it allows the gateway registration. This is required in case you have the IDoc listener or the function listener in your code and you're listening for IDoc or function. Next one is when a SAP IDoc is sent and it is received in MuleSoft, and when you log the received IDoc, you are seeing that it is not readable. Then most probably the SAP is not configured to accept Unicode communication. So in this scenario, you will have to ask the SAP team to set in their communication type with target system to accept Unicode communication. MuleSoft will only accept Unicode. MuleSoft the Unicode system, and it will work with that particular Unicode communication setting only. Otherwise, the IDoc will not be readable. All of this and many more are also there in MuleDocs SAP Connector um, troubleshoot, troubleshooting section. You can refer there as well. This is in this slide we see a common issue which is noticed when we are sharing code just to someone and they import it in their studio. Maybe after giving KT you are sharing your jar file to someone and they're importing in their studio. They do not have any configurations, and the SAP, you will see that the jar files are imported but the SAP libraries are not automatically imported. And if you try to reconfigure the JCO library or this IDocs from your safe local file, because this happens mostly when you are configuring from your local file. So when you are doing this, you will see it is not getting imported. It is still red. It is not working. So the solution is to delete the shared dependencies of SAP and the shared libraries and the dependencies from the POM file, save the POM file, and then do the configuration again. In this way, if you do, it will get configured and everything will be green. This is a common known issue I have faced in my different project scenarios where I have been working with SAP Connector. We covered SAP Connector that helps in integration with mainly SAP ECC system. Now, there are some more SAP Connector which leverages the SAP APIs. I will give a brief overview on them. There is MuleSoft SAP Concur Connector. This works on top of the SAP Concur REST APIs. There is SAP S4HANA Connector. It has two flavors, OData and SOAP. OData connector, which is built on top of OData APIs, exposed by SAP S4HANA Cloud and on-premise. Common use case for this connector is to perform CRUD operations on entity type of SAP S4HANA's OData APIs. The S4HANA SOAP connector, which is built on the SAP SOAP APIs that is exposed by the SAP S4HANA Cloud ERP. The latest 2.1 version of this connector also supports on-premise. There is another SuccessFactors connector which provides full support to query, create, update, delete, or CRUD entity operations under the OData APIs exposed by the SuccessFactors. Now, all these other connectors are built on top of APIs, so the configuration will be similar to how we configure API-based connector configurations. To highlight here, the SAP connector is a requires separate license and it is not available in Design Center feature. So if you're using it in production, you have to contact with your MuleSoft contact of your organization or project to discuss on this. That is all, guys. Thank you. If you have any questions or if you want to share any experience of your working with SAP with the group.
Kamalika, there is a question from Simendra.
Okay.
So PAPI supports both async and sync, and IDoc supports only async. Is that
Correct.
correct?
Correct. Yes. IDoc is used only for asynchronous communication. No response is expected from SAP side. Yes.
Okay. So anyone want to share their experience with SAP or have any questions? Please speak out. Jinesh, I think your mic is enabled. You can speak out.
Is it possible to receive an IDoc local system for debug purpose? You can connect if it so during our local development. This is I'm talking about my project experience. So we would connect to VPN, and then we would configure our SAP connector configurations, and we will receive IDoc or RFC. So for listeners, because if you are just sending or calling a remote function call, it is easy. But in case you are doing a listener job and mostly your IP will not be allowed at SAP site, so you will have to make special request to the SAP base system to allow temporarily allow your system's IP, so that it can register, the gateway registration can happen, and you can receive IDoc and RFC. Sorry Ajay, there would be no demo because as SAP is licensed, I don't have any account to demo. How to set timeout in RFC connector? I will get back to you on that. I'm just not remembering, but generally SAP reconnection is part of the JCO native library configurations.
So any more questions? There's a question from Anusha Kamnika.
Anusha, yes, SAP Connector supports RFC communication, but you can so SAP is capable of doing REST calls. So if your recipe developer is able to call your MuleSoft API or can send a HTTP request, that is possible. That is done. I have not covered it. It is not in my scope, but it is possible. Yes, and there you can configure TLS also. It is possible. Yes, not possible as per RFC, but that would be separate. That would be SAP doing a REST call through HTTP, HTTPS, and also MuleSoft calling SAP APIs.
Uh, Hey Malik, I have one question. Like, what's the difference between like SAP ABAP, I mean ABAP versus like S4 HANA?
Uh, there are different system, I guess, but I am not aware of this at all. I'm sorry.
Mhm. Okay, I
Mostly
have.
we are coming to SAP
So,
ECC.
Kamalika, may I try to answer that because
Yes,
I have
sure,
some
sure,
knowledge?
yes.
Yeah. Uh, so this is Joydeep. SAP ABAP is basically their programming language, their native programming language. So earlier we used to use SAP ECC, right, which is basically based on R3. Now it is on S4. So S4 HANA, that is a four-tier architecture. So SAP ABAP is basically the programming language for SAP.
Okay,
And for S4 HANA, we can also use Java, right?
right.
So these two are different types. ABAP is the programming language, right?
Mhm.
And S4 HANA is the system.
Okay, and what's the difference like between S S4 HANA versus I think that's one second.
ECC, SAP ECC.
Yeah.
So SAP ECC is mostly their on-premise version. Okay. So there is no cloud option, and the major architecture change is their underlying database. Right. Earlier they used to use Oracle database, but that is not, I mean, accessible to the ABAP developer or like any other integration team. But S4 HANA, they have moved their database. They are calling it HANA database, and that is basically kind of in-memory data grid, right, for faster processing. So
Right.
that is the major change in their architecture.
Got it. Thanks, Joy.
Thank you, Joydeep.
So I'd like to share my experience. I've been working in SAP integration for about 10 years
Yeah,
in
please.
yeah, various integration platform like web methods, then offlet in MuleSoft. So to configure, so first is Kamulika has nicely presented really very good information, Kamulika. Thank you for that. So I'd like to add few points here. One is to set up the local studio, right, to receive or to send IDoc. As Kamulika mentioned that we need to get the jar files, right? So this normally you will not get unless you have an SAP ID. So you have to ask your SAP team to provide that, or whoever has access to the SAP system, right? Normally an enterprise access is needed to get the jar files. uh, Second is to set up in studio, and if SAP has enabled their load balancer, right? So normally they use load balancer in production and in QA, but if they enable in dev or then you need to make an entry in the etc services, okay, using their message service. So this is very very technical, I'm not sure, I mean, uh, but if you set up your studio, that is needed. And if you are connecting to SAP, which is load balanced, you need to, add an entry into your etc services file with their message server id. And apart from that, what we normally have done in SAP integration is, it is very difficult, right? So if we have, let's say, 50 interfaces with SAP, product master, customer master, sales order, purchase order. So for each and every interface, they have a different IDoc type, right? uh, and for different IDoc type, if we have different APIs to communicate with SAP, they need to create different program ID, or let's say 50 program ID, which is a tedious task for SAP, right? As Kamalika had shared earlier. So Kamalika, if you can flash that screen, right, for the program ID, which is
Yes, sure,
needed
sure.
to configure, receiving IDocs.
Right.
So this problem we have faced. Sorry, this
Let me
is my,
find that. There
yeah,
is one question also. I was also wondering what is the best practice, like setting up so many unique program IDs, or what
exactly.
are
Yeah,
the
so I'm
other
coming to that
solutions?
part. Right, right. So there is a, setback from SAP saying that why we need to create this many program IDs. It's an overhead to maintain, right? For each and every interface, you're asking to create separate program ID. So what we have done, we have grouped this, like sales order related, you know interfaces, we create one program ID. Master data, we create another program ID. And then what we have done using that, yeah, if you can stay in the slide, document listener slide, Kamalika.
Okay.
I think, yeah, yeah. So here you can see that this is the program ID, right? And we are going to receive one IDoc here. So instead of that, what we have done, we have, created one program ID for multiple interfaces. So what will happen, this API or this app will receive multiple IDocs.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you know that, this IDoc needs to be routed to a particular process API? For example, customer master, we have one customer master process API. For material master, we have another API, right, which will only process customer master or material master, rather interface specific processing. So if we make this app as a generic, which is receiving multiple IDoc type customer product, right, then how can I route this to my appropriate downstream APIs? Okay, so what we have done, if you look at the IDoc structure, and Kamalika, may I request you to please again,
Yes.
yeah,
Sure. Sure. Sure.
navigate to the IDoc. Yeah. So if you see that each and every IDoc, starting with this particular IDoc name, orders 05. Now the question is, if you are receiving multiple IDoc types in the same app, how can I, route this to my particular APIs? So what we have done, we have a transform message and we basically use a dot parameter, right? So it will skip this part, which is specific to an IDoc. Then we navigate to this IDoc type. This IDoc type key, if you look at this, the EDIDC segment, which is basically the control segment of IDoc. Yes. So IDoc type is basically, so we get this IDoc type, and then we, put a cost reference in our property file. If the value is this is my corresponding API. So sometime what we have done for asynchronous processing, we publish to a queue and we get the queue name dynamically based on this IDoc type value, right? If it is ordered 05, my queue name will be order queue. If it is matmas, my queue name will be matmas queue. And then we used to publish that dynamically. So this is basically kind of, IDoc handler. We named it as a IDoc handler, or kind of a framework which dynamically route this without, creating multiple app for each and every interface. Similarly, if we are using a synchronous pattern, we give the corresponding API name, right? So if
Mhm.
this IDoc type is this is my process API or the downstream API for this order. If it is debmas, it will be customer master, process API. So that's how we used to route this. Yeah, thank you, Kamuliga.
Thank you. That is great. Even that also correlates with the reliability pattern where we are storing in the queue and then we are
Exactly. Yeah, yeah,
passing it so that because while you were discussing that, I also remember the first time we faced the issue where we were receiving so many iDocs and the iDoc listener and our flow gave a back pressure error. It was long
yeah.
back and we were like, what happened? What was the solution? So we implemented in that way. We receive it in a queue and then we put a queue in between and then we would
Yeah,
send.
normally use queues because SAP doesn't need any response.
Right.
Rather, we cannot send any response if we are receiving iDocs. So that's the better option to add a reliability, right?
Right.
So thank you, Joydeep. Thank you so much for making this a more interactive session by sharing your knowledge. We really appreciate it.
Welcome. Yeah.
So basically, we are conducting these sessions for this kind of interactions only. We have given some jobs like leading the groups or speaking as a speaker, speaking at these events, or like coming up with the topics. So whoever joining as an audience can share their experience and can share their knowledge as well to the rest of the audience. Basically, we are all in the comes in the same community, and we have to enhance our knowledge by either sharing our knowledge or taking their knowledge. That's it. What do you say, Ashish? Is Ashish still there?
No, I don't think so.
I think he's just. What do you say, Abhishek?
Yep, true. Like we are more acquainted to making networks and sharing our knowledge. So it is not like if the leader or the speaker has organized this, then they are only supposed to speak anything or share their knowledge. But it is for all of us, and we highly appreciate if all of you take our advantage of this type of sessions. Yeah.
So, can we move to trivia, Subham?
Yeah, sure. I think we have answered this question for Jinesh. Like, why is SAP inbound connection? Kamalika, can you answer that?
Uh, Depends on what is SAP inbound connection to MuleSoft are deployed on-prem, whereas outbound applications are deployed normally on cloud. Is it something that happened in your project? Can you elaborate a little bit more, Jinesh?
Yeah, sure, Kamalika. So, like in one of our applications, like we are using listener, I mean the SAP IDoc listener. So that is being deployed on-prem, whereas in the other applications, like we are sending data to SAP, whereas that is deployed on Cloud Hub. So I just wanted to know, like, what's the difference in this? Like, why did we do that?
Okay, and when you are sending response to SAP, how were you sending it? This is to Jinesh.
Yes, Kamalika.
What is the method in which you were sending response to SAP, like in your outbound application?
It was actually, I think, asynchronous RFC call.
Well, for me, um, I haven't faced this one, but mostly
So normally,
on-prem
um,
because yeah, Jaydeep, please go ahead.
yeah. So to configure listener, right? Uh, that works on the TCP/IP layer, right? I mean, if you are not using the HTTP one, And if you are using program ID, right, configured program ID, it is the connection type is TCP IP. So that is difficult. I mean, it is still doable, but I have seen that when we are receiving IDoc or when we are interacting with SAP using TCP IP layer, we have used the on-premise version, and while sending to SAP using OData or using any REST API, that is deployed in the Cloud Hub. So that is possible. The main reason I think is it is not recommended or difficult to open up the port and all in the Cloud Hub and setting up this connection, this TCP/IP connection. I mean, HTTP connection is easily configurable. TCP/IP is not, but still it is doable, right? As Kamalika has mentioned. So I could say that may be one of the reason.
Okay, okay. Thanks, Joydeep. Thanks, Kamalika.
All right. I think, do anyone has any more questions? All right. I think we don't have any. So let's move to the trivia. So we are playing the quiz on Kahoot. So I'm just pasting the pin here. Just enter, go to kahoot.it and this pin. Sharing the screen back.